Hi, welcome back to Faith and Conviction, and we want to go over this week's Torah portion, and it comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 47, verse 28 through the end of the book. So this Torah portion takes the last few chapters of Genesis, and it is called He Lived. And if I pronounce it right in Hebrew, it's Vayechi, Vayechi. And it is an interesting look here at what it means to live. So when we go through this Torah portion, I really have had to do some hours of research this time because of the way in which the Septuagint translates a word in verse 28 of chapter 47. So I don't want to give a whole lot of detail in this video segment. I would like for you to visit the website at faithandconviction.org and take a look at this video page and take a look at all the information that sits under it, because it will explain in greater detail anything that I can do on this video, because this really does have a nuance in the meaning of living, which is carried across only in the Septuagint. But we want to go into this and we want to take a look at this. So the first Hebrew word in verse 28 is the Hebrew word for this Torah portion. And it is associated with Strong's number H2421. And it's chaya, or life, live. Brown Driver Briggs gives us a whole bunch of definitions, and you can see it there at faithandconviction.org. So I just want to point out two or three, and it's to live, to have life, to remain alive. But then there's this idea that it also has, and it's a nuance, and it's to preserve life. So I want you to keep that one in mind, because that's really what we're going to touch base on down here with chapter 47, verse 28 as we get to it. But there's also an interesting aspect to this word in King James, because in two verses it translates it a little bit different. So in Isaiah 7 and verse 21 it says, "It shall come to pass in that day a man shall nourish a young cow and two sheep." So nourish, and in a way nourishment does give life, so consider that as well. In 1 Chronicles 11:8, he built the city round about, even from Millo round about, and Joab repaired the rest of the city. So these two words in the King James actually represent this Hebrew word for life, because one of the aspects of life is to be restored to life. And that's one of the things you can see there with the Brown Driver Briggs down at the bottom of this page at faithandconviction.org. But let's go back to Genesis 47 verse 28, because that's our Torah portion and that's where it starts. It says in the King James, "And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years." So the Complete Jewish Bible and the Jewish Publication Society, this one here, all translate that Hebrew word as lived. And if we look down here in chapter 50 and verse 22, it also talks about Joseph having lived a certain amount of time. So the King James says Joseph lived 110 years. And the Complete Jewish Bible, and again this Jewish Publication translation, has lived. Now what's interesting though is that's not the only time that this word live is found in our Torah portion. So let's go up into chapter 50 and verse 20, because it's a very interesting thing here. And it actually plays a little bit into what we're going to talk about with our Torah portion. The King James in verse 20 says, and I'm just abbreviating it here, "God meant it for good." That's Joseph's travel into Egypt, "to save much people alive." That's the King James. The Complete Jewish Bible renders it like this: "God meant it for good, with many people's lives being saved." Many people's life being saved. And the Jewish Publication, this one here, says God meant it for good, the survival of many people. Now what's interesting when I was doing this study is the way in which the Jewish Publication Society translates verse 20 of chapter 50 for that Hebrew word live, calls it survival. And that really is where my study took me, and I wasn't really expecting that. So the Jewish Publication Society does a translation of that word in a way that stands to an idea that I think is found back in chapter 47 verse 28. And when you look at the Septuagint's translation of that verse, it has Ep Edson de Jacob in gay, and then it's the word Egypt there, Deka Epta Ete. basically being translated, he survived in Jacob in the land of Egypt 10 and 7 years. So I want us to consider this, and I had put the word survive there on purpose, because as I was studying this exen doesn't have a Strong's number association with it per se when I looked at it in an eSword. So I had to use my Apostolic Bible Polyglot, and it helped me a little bit, and it connects over to a word that is considered an adjective. And you can see some of that information down there on the bottom of the page. I don't want to get too detailed. But really what that word has is it has the word epi and zao in it. That's two Greek words. Epi is a preposition meaning on, and zao means life, to live. So they translate it a little bit different here in this one verse, but not down there in chapter 50, verse 22. They use a different variation of the Greek word live. It's a zao variant. They could have easily put the preposition on top or in front of that word rather, but they did not do so. So they're really trying to communicate this idea that Jacob survived down there in Egypt, and he went there to survive. So he lived on in Egypt. And this was an amazing little find for me, because it would be so easy to just translate it as live, like the King James does, like the Complete Jewish Bible does, like JPS itself does in chapter 47, verse 28. They all say live. But the Greek Old Testament gives a nuance to the meaning to preserve alive. And so sometimes their trek into Egypt is seen as captivity, which it will become. But when they go into Egypt, it's actually for preservation. And the Greek Old Testament really captures that idea, and that's why it carries the idea that Jacob survived. So this is really powerful. So in the New Testament, you have the word zao used all over with to live and to different types of living. And zao, I found it all over in the Greek Old Testament. It was in the Torah, meaning the 5 books of Moses, and the prophets, and in the writings. I'm using the Tanakh order there. So it's all over. But in chapter 47, verse 28, it's the only time that the preposition is put in front of that Greek word. And that really signifies a powerful idea that the Septuagint translators are trying to convey to those readers and to us. So Jacob goes down there and lives on. He survives in Egypt. And this is a good thing. This is a good thing. So as we close out, and we want to talk about a little bit about the Messiah, as I was meditating about this and praying about it, I was wondering how we could connect it to Jesus, the Messiah. And the idea of John 10 and verse 10 showed up in my thinking. And Jesus says in the last part of that verse, I am come that they might have life. Zao. That it's a noun there, but it's from the verb life, or to live. And it is that they might have it, meaning life, more abundantly. So Jesus wants to give us not just a survival, but life. He wants us to have more than just survival. God wants us to do more than just survive. He wants us to thrive. But when we see how the Septuagint translators make something work from the Hebrew into the Greek, and then we're looking at it from the Greek New Testament into the English, we can see how God is working through all these things, not just to give life and to create life and to sustain life, but to give it more abundantly. And these are the beauty and the power of Moses and the power of Messiah, and why we can read all of these languages and see how powerful it is that God has preserved the scriptures for us. I hope it's been a blessing to you. May you have a blessed new year as it comes around. Until next time we get together, continue to seek God, know Messiah, find hope.